The last few years have spawned a new kind of game. Be it because of the growing disdain for the live service software model or simply the aging of the video game medium, indie developers have found a new way to unnerve us. With dead games. I don't mean games that have actually died, but instead those that simulate it. Those games that are made for the sole purpose of letting us experience a game that has been left to rot. Today I'm going to look at some of them, each with their own approach and each representing a different kind of death that a game can experience. Because there are multiple kinds, ranging from the colloquial to the more real. The first game we're going to look at is very close to my heart, and long-term followers of this channel will know this game very, very well. When most people say that a game is dead, this is what they mean. A game once full of people going about their business, now barren. Few genres feel this quite as strongly as MMOs. If you've ever wandered around in a very old or otherwise obscure MMO, you'll recognize quite how much emptier and less complete they feel than any other kind of game when they've died. And that's what we're experiencing here, in the long-forgotten MMO, Plaza 96. But not really, because Plaza 96 does not exist. The real game we're playing is Pagan Autogeny, where we take the role of someone, Vivian, returning to an old game that has certainly seen better days. But instead of being empty or feeling incomplete, the developer of Pagan, Oleander Garden, has decided to play around with this idea and treat the game like a living entity. One that has been left to rot. I covered this game several years ago, but I can't help but feel that this is an aspect of the game I failed to cover comprehensively. If you happen to stumble across any standard enemies in the game, you'll see they look like this. Weird, geometrically inclined texture messes. I don't know exactly what kind of shape they are, but they seem like the kind of thing a D&D enthusiast just kind of owns. I think in my first playthrough, I acknowledged that they were strange, but I didn't really clock why they looked like that. But in one small and obscure area of the game, you can find this guy, who is dressed a little too much like John Dark Souls for my liking, and seeing this guy made me realize something. This is probably roughly what everyone else used to look like, or at least something similar. And that's backed up by the fact that some NPCs and enemies, namely the bosses, maintain some or all of their model's integrity. It was the lesser ones that rotted away first. Model corruption isn't the only kind of physical rot this game contains though, as there are some people and items in the game that seem to have become two-dimensional. Again, I didn't clock this first time around, but this character here is two-dimensional but has maintained most of her texture quality, and these houses back here have become flat. At least, presumably they've lost a dimension because there are no other flat buildings in the game. And my personal favorite detail is that there are only 1 or 2 areas in the entire game that contain any music. At least any intact music. And this is, again, something I didn't really register before. It's not that these areas were the only ones to contain music before the game died, it's that they're the only ones that haven't lost it yet. In some areas you can hear a kind of white noise ambience where music presumably once was, and in others you can hear the quiet remnants of music amidst a mess of noise and corruption. And one thing that I'm uncertain about, but it may be the most poignant of all, is that the 5 stats that the player character can level up have absolutely no gameplay function. None whatsoever. In terms of other uses they have, there's 1 door you can unlock if you get all of the stats up to level 10, but there's really no reason to. If that is an intended part of the game's rot, we can see that even the player character is not immune. And we can see other players' characters too, seemingly long abandoned and just present in the game. When interacted with, they just echo one phrase that they presumably said back when they had someone behind them, but now they're just static husks clinging on. There's some other stuff in similar veins to what I've already mentioned, like the endless fog and distortion in certain areas and the fact that certain items have no use whatsoever, but it's hard to figure out if these were in the game before its death or not, because, well, the devs behind Plaza 96 were a little eccentric. Hell, the game opens with the loading screen stating, "The home of user hostile design," which, to be fair, is quite the claim given how many early MMOs were the most user-hostile experiences known to man. You know, when World of Warcraft launched in 2004, people thought it was too easy and forgiving and straightforward. If you've played it recently, you'll know that Vanilla WoW/WoW Classic is an incredibly obnoxious experience by today's standards. You want to run for 45 real-world minutes to hand in a quest for 1/50th of a level? You want to have 70% of the game's specializations be borderline unusable? You want to be able to fail at picking flowers? I could go on. God, I love the game, but Jesus Christ, we have seriously streamlined player experiences over the years. Anyway, that actually leads me on to a pretty interesting question, that being, why do games, particularly MMOs, die in the way that Plaza 96 did? The most obvious answer is that people gradually lose interest due to a lack of updates or excitement around the game, and that's true, but I think the biggest reason is that other games, newer games, tend to be a lot more palatable. For as much as we love older games and for as many memories they give us, if something comes along that is more focused, intuitive, accessible, or hell, even the same as the old but slightly better or fresher in any number of ways, people will migrate. That might sound obvious because it is, but I feel that some people get unnecessarily bitter about this kind of game death. They dig their heels in and deny that anything new is superior or even more exciting because nothing can compare to the memories of old. I'm not talking about the niche communities that form around old games, they're usually very chill and welcoming. I mean the people that get angry and tribal about it. And the sad thing is, for these people, if they took off their rose-tinted glasses and gave the new things a shot, they might realize the truth, even if the new thing isn't for them, that the thing they loved faded into obscurity for a reason. And that's fine. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that new is better or more exciting than old in every circumstance, that's absolutely not the case, but with multiplayer games and MMOs in particular, it's shockingly common. Like I said, World of Warcraft was hated by quite a lot of people when it came out because it was too soft or cartoony or forgiving. That sounds absurd, but for people who played games like Neocron or other similar hardcore permadeath games, they looked down on it. And then World of Warcraft went on to effectively dominate the space for the next 10 to 15 years by not only plucking existing MMO players that saw that the fresh grass was greener, but also new people that previously didn't care for the genre because of its old sensibilities. Then, poetically, in 2021 or so, people that played WoW saw other games like Final Fantasy XIV and saw that the grass was greener there. It's only because World of Warcraft itself is choosing to adapt that it's getting players back. If games don't learn from their own or others' mistakes, and they fail to adapt to modern sensibilities, they die. And you know what? That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. The slow decay of an increasingly obscure and overshadowed MMO is one of the kindest deaths a game can have. While it's tragic and a little unsettling to see an empty MMO, the alternative is it either no longer existing at all, or the industry stagnating completely, and those are far worse fates. Being able to experience an empty MMO you used to play is also a very cathartic experience, in some ways, because it triggers a lot of memories and realizations not only about your own time in the game, but the industry as a whole. If this idea resonates with you at all, I highly recommend you watch my last video, The Haunted Facades and Liminal Spaces of Azeroth. While it might not appeal to the horror fan audience I typically appeal to, it's probably my favorite video I've ever made, and from what I can tell, a lot of you liked it even if MMOs aren't your thing. I made at least one person cry with it too, which is a new one for this channel. Anyway, going back to Pagan, you may be wondering two things. Firstly, why is it called Pagan? I have no idea. Secondly, why is it called pagan autogeny? Well, I'll let the me from 5 years ago explain.
A hypothetical organic phenomenon by which living organisms are created from non-living matter. Autogenesis, or autogeny. This game markets itself as delivering the experience of a dead MMO, but the reality is far more haunting. You're experiencing a living MMO.
Good God, why did I sound like that?
A hypothetical organic phenomenon.
Anyway, autogeny in the case of this game refers to the fact that in this dead MMO, rotting code is bringing out new life. While NPCs and enemies, as well as the very environments and possibly even the player character themselves, are deteriorating, there are also new things appearing in the game. Life from non-living matter. Or, as I said it back then, from non-living matter. I won't delve too deep into what I mean by this, because I would love it if some of you can go and experience this game yourself. It's genuinely one of the best horror game experiences I've ever had, and the exploration and experimentation required to get its endings are just wonderful. Don't worry, it's not a jump scare game, it's much more of a brooding and unsettling thing than scary per se. It was ahead of its time with the liminal space horror, analog horror, and hey, it's even got Chernobyl in it for you nuclear disaster fans out there. I'll give you some tips if you're going to play it. Firstly, the game comes with a PDF manual. Use it. Secondly, there are loads of tarot cards in the game that act as your main tools for killing enemies, but there's one that spawns constantly and it's fucking useless. Tarot Zero, the Fool. This thing is everywhere and it sucks. Bin it. Thirdly, sometimes walls are just a suggestion. And here's a fun fact for you. If you go to the Steam page, the footage used in the trailer, as well as one or two of the screenshots, were all recorded by this guy. I don't know if the mic picked it up, but if it was unclear, I was pointing at myself. While I could talk a little more about rot in regards to this game, I think I could benefit a little more from showing you another game first. So for now, that's all I've got on Pagan Autogeny, but don't worry, it'll be back on the channel again. It always will. Remember, Painticus has played 4 games in his life, and any excuse to talk about them, he will take. Oh shit, one last tip for people who might want to play Pagan Autogeny. Keep the martyr restrained. Just trust me, you don't want to end up like... No Players Online was among the first of the Haunted PS1 style hits, coming as part of a Haunted PS1 game jam before even the first official demo disc came out. It was huge, at least as huge as a short micro-budget game jam indie horror experience can be. Hell, you can likely count on one hand how many game jam games have their own Wikipedia pages, so you know this one has to be a big deal. And it's easy to see why. Few notable games before this captured the idea of haunted software, and even fewer did so in the unique setting of an abandoned FPS game. The mix of capitalizing on nostalgia for games like GoldenEye or TimeSplitters with its setting, and hopping on the, at the time, emerging trend of analog/retro horror games in the neat and accessible format of a walking simulator, was perfect. It even incorporated ARG elements, which was a stroke of genius as well. But, in my humble opinion, it hasn't aged well, and I'll explain why later in the video, but for now, let's look at what it actually is. Like I said, it's fundamentally a walking simulator, which has you walking through an empty capture the flag server in an old FPS game. Again, games that are empty when they shouldn't be are spooky enough as is, but this one has a little more up its sleeve. As you walk through, you start to experience some strange things. The world darkens slightly, objects flicker in the corner of your vision, players join your server but don't actually appear, and strange, mournful music starts emanating from a mysterious music box. And eventually, you get confronted with it. A ghoul. Shortly after, a real player joins the game, which just so happens to be the game's developer. And you can tell, because his name is John Dev, which is simply sensational. And through some in-game messages, he tells you that the game was not meant to be accessible. This is a private project not meant for the public eye. And John Dev is up to... And John Dev is up to something a little more esoteric and unsettling. He has captured the soul of his dead wife in the game, and if the game is to conclude, her soul will be set free. Personally, if I had my soul trapped in an FPS map, I'd pick a better one like Mexican Mission or Nightclub. So John Dev says don't capture the flag, otherwise he'll lose his wife forever. So we quit out. Then we remembered that if we get one more loss, we'll be demoted to Iron rank, so sorry John, the grind don't stop. I love that you can just hop onto a different server and continue playing, that's hilarious. Now, there is another ending which involves breaking out of bounds and whatnot, but for our intents and purposes today, the two endings we've seen, either quitting out of the game or finishing it to shut it all down, are most important. This is the perfect, fictional, example of what I reckon is the most common kind of game death. Abandonment. This was a work-in-progress game from John Dev that he never finished. It's one that, as far as we can tell, was never released in any capacity, and that's where most game deaths occur. The developer never finishes them, because either they can't find a way to, some other factor comes along that throws a spanner in the works, or it can even be as simple as the developer themselves moving on to something else. It's not just unreleased games that this applies to either. If you're a long-term indie horror fan, you'll be painfully aware of what I'm about to talk about, but for those who are newer or simply less involved, I want you to try something. Go to itch.io, GameJolt, or any other indie game aggregator site and scroll through the horror section. You can look with any filter, newest games, most popular games, top rated games, whatever, it doesn't matter. Alternatively, go to any YouTuber who plays or played indie horror games on their channel. Markiplier, John Wolfe, any of them. Watch a few of their videos. How many of the games you see are demos? How many are early access? A lot of them, right? It's kind of a meme at this point that the horror genre in particular is stacked with them. And that's cool, demos are neat, it's great to see a small slice of what a developer is working on. Now take a look at how many of these demos and early access games ever led to full releases. How many were ever finished? The number is staggeringly low. And you don't need to look far for examples. Let's look at the first Haunted PS1 demo disc that I mentioned earlier. That came out over 4 years ago. The games on that had some of the most hype and excitement and exposure and support of any indie horror projects at the time, and half of them have been fully released. A few have seemingly been completely abandoned, and 1 or 2 seem to be in limbo, or development hell if you're feeling cynical. And if that's happening in one of the most developer-friendly and resource-abundant communities in indie game development, imagine how low the completion rate is outside of that. It's pretty sad when you scroll through indie game sites because you see so many games that were abandoned, and those are just the lucky ones that reached a demo-worthy state to begin with. And don't get me wrong, this is not a slight against those developers, not at all. God knows I've abandoned so many projects that I cared about for dozens of different reasons. Sadly, there are often more reasons to stop than there are to continue. Even on this channel, I've had lengthy upload hiatuses where I've been working on videos that never made it to release because I couldn't find a way to make them work. I wasn't happy with them, the topics were flawed to begin with, someone else came out with something similar before me, and so on. And as much as that sucks, stopping those projects was the right thing to do. The worst thing you can do as someone who makes any kind of media is get dragged into the sunk cost fallacy. If there's one thing I wish could be instilled into every single person's mind, it's that sometimes you have to kill a project. Not everything you want to be made will be made. Not everything you want to make can be made. Not everything you want to make should be made. And that's okay. Every creative person on the planet goes through the stage where they think they are the exception to that rule, and nobody is. Not one person. No, not even you. I know there's one of you out there who has a quiet voice in your head that's trying to somehow explain how this universal truth does not apply to you, and how through the power of perseverance and willpower you can eventually make anything work, and that voice is wrong. That is the voice that will lead you to tragedy, and I know that because, believe me, we all have that voice. Yes, it's a sad thing to accept. It's not something that most people want to accept. We often view creativity as this wide open space where you can follow your dreams and achieve anything, but sometimes dreams lead you to bad places, dead ends, time sinks, and sometimes they pull you away from your other dreams that have much nicer outcomes. Anyone who's been in a creative field for any substantial length of time will already know this horrible truth, but sometimes you're the ones who need to hear it most. It doesn't magically vanish with experience. So, how in the hell does this relate to No Players Online? Well, we've got a game that was never released, that the developer obsesses over, and that holds a soul hostage. Sorry, John Dev. And you're welcome. Whereas the death of MMOs and other multiplayer games is sad for the players, this kind of death, abandonment, is most sad for the developers. Projects you once put so much into will be left to rot in obscurity. But I think rot gets a bad rap. When a game is abandoned or a game loses its players, it doesn't vanish. It doesn't become wasted time. Everyone who worked on it learned from it. Everyone who played it took something from it. All of its memories and potential is carried on by the people it affected. Rotting is not the process of something breaking down and slowly disappearing. It's the start of a new cycle. In nature, it's just bacteria and fungus recycling old unused material to make something new. It's not this scary process where grim figures pull something into the Shadow Realm. It's one of the most wonderful processes in existence, and it's one of the most fundamental forces behind new life. And that's what happens with these dead games. We take parts of them, modernize them, reimagine them, lovingly take inspiration from them. We learn why they failed or lost players. We learn what could have prevented that. We take these things we spent time on and we use that as fuel for something new. The biggest example I can think of with this is Silent Hills. Silent Hills is a dead game. It was abandoned. But we got PT, its teaser/demo, and, for better or worse, there has been no greater force in the horror genre over the last decade than PT, and it's not even close. And again, that's a dead game. You might think that the title of this video is clickbait now. Surely it should be something like Rotting Code, the bittersweet repurposing of dead games, but no, there's more to come. Anyway, before I move on to the third game I want to look at, I want to talk a little bit more about No Players Online. Because I don't like it. That might be a bit harsh, but it does something that's a real pet peeve of mine. It leans way too hard into the retro theme, to the point of absurdity. So, the game's basic aesthetic works very well because it's trying to emulate a certain era of shooter games, and that's fine, it does a great job there. But the devs couldn't help themselves. They also make it so that all of the gameplay you see is being recorded on a VHS tape. There's no reason for this other than it being another retro motif, but it's not one that fits here. We already have the late 90s, early 2000s game aesthetic, and that works. Why are we also including a found footage element? And from here, it really goes off the rails. The VHS tape that this project is being recorded onto is labeled Capture the Flag Project Footage 20th of March, 1986. 90s game aesthetic, found footage film, based in the 80s. Which is also absurd because this is what games looked like in the 80s, not this. And now for the real kicker. The dev, in-game, states that he has been working on it for 11 years. Which means this game started development in 1975. This is incredible. We have 4 separate retro horror tropes working in complete disharmony. We have the late 1990s game visuals, found footage format, 1980s setting, and old forgotten software. Any one of those work. Hell, even mix 2 of them and you could be fine. But 4 of them? That is fucking crazy talk. That is the retro horror equivalent of having your cake and eating it too, then stealing 2 other people's cakes and throwing them directly at the viewer. You could argue that the devs are trying to cook something interesting here with the setting and story, but I don't think so. Because in the server list for this game, which, may I remind you, has never been publicly released, there are 6 established and unofficial community servers, 4 of which are still active. Why would there be community servers for an unreleased game at all, and who the fuck is maintaining them? So no, I don't think the developers were cooking here. I think they were just throwing a bunch of motifs at the wall and didn't think too much about it. Which, you know, whatever. But there's been a development. Recently, the developers have released a demo for a full-blown remake of the game, and it's incredible. And I mean that. It has left one of the best impressions on me that any indie game has in a very long time, and I would love to talk your ear off about it, but I don't want to spoil anything, and given that it's pretty short so far, despite being substantially longer than the original game, I would quickly delve into spoiler territory by default. I mean, first of all, it abandons the VHS gimmick, which is huge. Secondly, it gives you a whole computer to play with. Like, you just get to explore this Windows 95-like machine, and it's so cool. You can hop onto a forum and browse through it, you can download games and not only play them, but fuck around with their files and replace stuff too. Now this visual novel has shark-killing music. Hell yeah. It's reminiscent of those games like Simulacra or Orwell, if you've played those, where you sift through files and messages trying to find information, and I adore that kind of thing. God, I want to gush more about this so badly, but I'll keep it vague. The writing is wonderful, the exploration is exceptional, the game is intuitive while not being tutorial-y, and when it gets spooky, it gets so much more spooky than the original. It's genuinely super unsettling. And hey, when you get into the Capture the Flag game again, you have to make your own server, because it's an unreleased game. They did it, they made it make sense. The dates and play are still questionable. I think they're settling on this whole 70s, 80s thing, which is a bit annoying, but hey, I can't hold a grudge. This demo is too good. Go play it, it's linked in the description. And please, good lord, please, let this demo turn into a full game. But now we have to lower the mood a little bit, for there is a third kind of game death that I want to talk about today, and it's substantially less bittersweet than the other two. It's simply bitter. Now, dear viewer, I have a problem. That problem being that I tend to formulate ideas for videos based around one single concept. And they're usually concepts that have a decent amount of evidence, or at least they have, some points to discuss. For example, the unused areas of games being a little unsettling, or Amnesia the Bunker containing a lot of Penumbra DNA. Yet, sometimes I get overconfident. My wax wings melt in the heat of my own hubris, because sometimes these assumptions are totally incorrect, and the entirety of a video's concept falls apart. But the good thing about melted wax wings is that they can sometimes help craft some interesting candles. Let me explain what I mean. I saw this game, The Agony of a Dying MMO, and I assumed that it was a game about the agony of a dying MMO. The screenshots and description and general vibe and title seemed to corroborate this idea, and I based the entirety of this video's concept around including this game as a central talking point and as the main example of the third kind of video game death that I want to discuss. And, well, I got it wrong. That's not what this game is about, and I discovered that very late into the writing process for this video. Surprisingly, this game is substantially less interested in discussing the cool concept of an MMO's final moments before being shut down, and is instead more interested in discussing the equally cool but largely unrelated concepts of being terminally online, engaging in toxic communities, and finding unhealthy coping mechanisms, which, again, are very poignant and important themes, but the MMO and game parts in general are almost entirely replaceable. This could be the sadness of a discontinued forum, the pain of a soon-to-be deleted Discord server, the discomfort of a banned Facebook meme page, or Twitter simulator, and almost all of its content would still be applicable, which kinda throws a spanner in the works for me, because that means it really doesn't relate to this video. At all. But maybe that's perfect for this video, because this type of game death is best visualized with nothing. Because I'm talking about games that are killed. Look around at the video game medium right now. It's bigger than it has ever been, and despite what people on Twitter and Reddit and Discord and YouTube will tell you, it's in a pretty fucking good shape. We not only have access to more games, emulators, audiences, development tools, marketing tools, and any other resource that you can possibly imagine than at any other time in history, where the biggest downside for aspiring developers is the sheer amount of competition created by this accessibility. And for consumers, that's not a bad thing. But we also have the tools and the will and the ability to revive games that have been lost or abandoned in the past. Look at how many communities online not only exist, but are thriving despite being based on games that are 20 plus years old that would otherwise be long forgotten. Look at the modding communities that have continued to develop in not only skill and creativity, but scope and support. And this doesn't just apply to video games themselves. Look at video game adjacent media as well. Like this very video. 20 years ago, not only would it have been so much harder to make this video, but I guarantee it would have received almost no traction whatsoever unless it was miraculously picked up by a major corporate entity. Things have never been more in our hands. When you see headlines or tweets or forum posts or videos telling you that gaming is dead or being ruined by whatever the controversial flavor of the month is, know this: you're being scammed. Because despite all of the great things that have come to us the last few decades, one thing hasn't changed: the fact that outrage sells. People will try and tell you that everything is terrible now because of the recent development of X, Y, or Z, and let's be real, they're usually just saying, oh my god, women and or gay people exist. How dare they? And the people that say this kind of thing are just bidding in the great algorithmical auction house for your time. They just want your clicks and your tiny contribution to their ad payouts, regardless of whether or not you agree with them, and regardless of whether or not they believe the shit they're saying. I mean, either that or they're genuinely delusional and have the memory of a goldfish. And I can say that confidently, because you can go back to any year in the past century and you will find people saying the exact same shit as these new people about games, movies, books, music, whatever. Remember, people used to think that Dungeons and Dragons was evil witchcraft. People used to think Pokemon was satanic. Mortal Kombat was gonna turn everyone into violent freaks, televisions were gonna melt your brain, rock music will turn everyone into perverts, and now Star Wars is gonna infect us with the woke mind virus? Oh my god, tell me, is the woke mind virus in the room with us right now? And guess what? None of these mediums are dead. Not one of them. Have they changed? Absolutely, but almost the entirety of their history before these changes has been preserved. So if gaming in 2024 or any other year is no longer for you, I can happily tell you that there are decades worth of games that are. More games than you can possibly aim to play in your entire life. And that's why lost media is such a spooky and intriguing topic, because almost all media is preserved. And that which isn't is tragic and mysterious. So how does this relate to dead games? Well, unfortunately, there is a real threat to this pretty great time that we're in. And it's much more mundane than any pseudo-political or societal bullshit that clickbait grifters will try to sell you. Look again at the current gaming sphere. What are some of the biggest names out there? Fortnite, League of Legends, Call of Duty, Apex Legends, Overwatch, Valorant, Helldivers 2, Genshin Impact, Dead by Daylight, World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV, and I could go on. What do all of these have in common? As things are, these games will die. And I don't mean the healthy death of a game that gradually loses players or fades into obscurity. I mean the developer-sanctioned murder of these games. Any game with mandatory anti-cheat, official-only servers, always online DRM, and anything else that requires the developers to actively maintain the game via server will disappear. Completely. Because almost every company that makes DRM-heavy games will, and several already have, actively shut down any community-run attempt to keep these games alive. Because they can't stand to see their products used without their constant supervision or profit. And they would rather wipe these things off the face of the earth than see somebody else preserve them. This may sound extreme. Why would game devs retroactively destroy their own products? Why would they stop people from playing them? Well, we don't need to speculate on the theory of it because it's already happened dozens of times. Remember Call of Duty Warzone? A few years ago, you couldn't escape it. It was enormous. It was easily the second biggest battle royale game after Fortnite, and now? Dead. Not unsupported or with a low player count. It's gone. Overwritten, cannibalized, and replaced by another game that took its name. The video game equivalent of being buried in a sealed lead coffin at an unmarked grave and having someone else take your name. Overwatch. Another enormous game. A fucking titanic entity, and it's gone. Unplayable. Replaced with a similar yet notably different game in Overwatch 2. The millions of collective hours played in these are wiped from existence. Inaccessible, and not only that, but illegal to revisit. It's not just multiplayer games, this has happened to single-player games too. Check out this video from Ross Scott about the game Darkspore, for example. And it's not a matter of games shutting down servers for cost purposes either. They will hunt down attempts to revive these games, even if people are doing it for them. Before World of Warcraft Classic was launched, a myriad of private servers existed that allowed people to experience the otherwise lost 2004 to 2006 version of the game, and Blizzard actively hunted down these servers and brought legal action upon them despite no longer selling that product themselves. It was effectively abandonware, but that didn't stop them. One of the first edited videos I ever put up on YouTube was my adventures on one of these servers with a friend of mine. Now everything I did there is gone. And I have 7 minutes of video to remember it by, and that's it. I can never go back. Now Ubisoft is doing something new. Revoking licenses from users who bought their games so nobody can legally access it because large companies, and even smaller ones, are no longer selling actual games. They are selling you the privilege of accessing them for a transient moment in history before ripping it all away. Think about the wording used by developers when discontinuing games. Even the words are deceptive. Ending support is the most common one. Developers, you are not ending support, you are destroying it. Ending support implies that the devs are stepping back, not preventing it from ever being played again, which is much closer to the truth 9 times out of 10. Game companies are trying so hard to convince us that they are doing us a favor by giving us fleeting glimpses into their games, but that's not the case at all. We are doing them a favor by buying their fucking products. I mean, the very least they could do is give us those products in return. So yeah, I have no game to show for this kind of death because this is a very different kind. There's nothing there to rot. Just an empty space where something used to be. But all hope is not lost. Technically, this practice of killing games is illegal in many countries, granted, only by similar precedent in other media forms. Yet it's rarely, if ever, enforced. However, there are efforts being made to prevent this and turn all of these killed games into user-friendly and legally archivable abandonware. Check out these videos by Ross Scott for more and do whatever you can to support it. But let's be real, this is not what people want to hear, and this is not what people want to talk about. Let's go back to the things that are really, really important. Like, oh, did you guys know they put a woman in Star Wars? Gaming truly is dead.